Isaac Dow was a reclusive elderly man who spent his final years living in East Benton, Maine, in a rudimentary log hut he constructed himself at over 70 years of age. Prior to this, he had spent most of his life in Winslow, where he and his wife raised 3 sons. Dow worked for many years as a cooper, building and repairing wooden barrels, tubs, and casks, a trade that provided a stable livelihood for his family. As time passed, his sons reached adulthood, and his wife's health declined. Isaac devoted himself to her care during her prolonged illness, ultimately exhausting his savings. After her passing, he chose to live in seclusion, building a modest cabin in the woods outside Winslow. However, local authorities eventually required him to move into the Winslow Town Farm. Town farms, common during the Victorian era, were precursors to modern-day homeless shelters. Residents, often referred to as paupers, were provided with basic room and board in exchange for labor to support the farm's operation. These facilities were typically located on the outskirts of town and aimed to be largely self-sufficient, with residents caring for livestock, growing crops, and performing other tasks. Town farms were usually managed by a married couple who lived on site and received a small stipend from the town. Isaac Dow was deeply unhappy with this arrangement. Seeking to regain his independence, he relocated to Benton, which at the time did not maintain a town farm. This allowed him to receive limited public assistance while living on his own. With no financial resources, he found an isolated area in East Benton known as Hardscrabble, a term often used to describe land with poor, uncultivable soil, where he built a small shack near a shallow bog. The cabin, described by neighbors as the most miserable little affair, measured only 10 by 12 feet and was built from thick logs with mud packed between the gaps for insulation. The roof consisted of poles covered with mud and hay. Inside, his belongings were minimal: a broken stove held together with wire, a makeshift bed of hay, old rugs, and a tattered quilt. He also had a single chair, a few utensils, a frying pan, a baking sheet, and a tin plate. A small garden outside the hut produced limited food in summer, but Dow primarily relied on the charity of the town and a few compassionate neighbors. One such neighbor was Mr. Gibson, who lived about a mile away with his family. While Dow had once been able to walk to their home for meals, in his final years he became too frail to make the journey. In an act of kindness, Mr. Gibson's children would pull him to their home on a sled, and Mr. Gibson himself often delivered firewood to the hut, sometimes arriving just in time to prevent Dow from freezing. Several months before Isaac Dow's death, the town of Benton had acquired a property on Unity Road to serve as a town farm. Officials made repeated efforts to persuade Dow to relocate there, where he would have had access to food, shelter, and basic care. However, he steadfastly refused, insisting that he would not live anywhere but in the crude cabin he had built for himself. For as long as Benton lacked a town farm, the town had supported Dow with small provisions that allowed him to live independently, albeit in hardship. But following the purchase of the farm the previous spring, town officials determined that he should be moved there for his own safety and well-being. Dow rejected the proposal outright, and in response, the town withdrew its assistance, leaving him to survive as best he could on his own. Unfortunately, on a January night in 1899, shortly after 8 o'clock, one of Mr. Gibson's children stepped outside and noticed a faint light in the distance. Mistaking it for the rising moon, he casually pointed it out to his parents. However, when he returned to the door a short time later, he realized with alarm that the light was not celestial. It was fire. Flames were visibly pouring from the roof of Isaac Dow's cabin. Upon recognizing the danger, Mr. Gibson immediately summoned a neighbor, and the 2 men set out toward the burning structure. When Mr. Gibson and his neighbor arrived at the scene, they saw Isaac Dow inside the burning cabin, struggling in vain to escape. Flames had engulfed the structure, forming an impenetrable wall that trapped him within. Repeatedly, the elderly man attempted to reach the door, and just as often, the men outside tried to intervene. But the intense heat and rapidly advancing fire made any rescue impossible. All they could do was wait helplessly as the fire consumed the building. The hut, constructed from thick logs over a foot in diameter, had been built many years earlier and was thoroughly dried out. As a result, the structure burned slowly but intensely, and it was several hours before the flames subsided enough for the men to safely enter. Only then were they able to recover what remained of Isaac Dow. Though Isaac Dow was known as a man of uncertain temper and difficult disposition, the severe hardship of his later years evoked sympathy. His story remains a poignant example of endurance, independence, and the quiet generosity of neighbors.